Hello and welcome. My name's Greg Surratt.
And I'm Darrin Patrick.
And you're listening to our new podcast, The Pastors Collective. And on this show, we're going to talk about pastoring, what it's like, pastoring in the trenches, the real work, the real challenges, and the real joys of serving churches. You'll hear from us, and you'll hear from pastors all around the country, and you'll also hear some unfiltered truth about what makes this work so hard and so rewarding.
So to kick things off, on our first couple of episodes, you're going to hear some conversations between Greg and I as we talk about our own calling, our journeys in ministry, and a little bit of our heart for the work we're trying to do here. We're trying to serve other pastors with what we've learned along the way. And today, that means I get to interview you, Pastor Greg.
Oh, that's scary. I'm glad you are. And thanks for tuning in. And we hope that you guys are going to enjoy the conversation.
So, what was it like? You were a pastor's kid in a Assembly of God context. What was that like?
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful to a large degree for my heritage. I really am. My father was, when I was born, my father was a full-time evangelist. Would travel from place to place. He started preaching when he was 14 years old and always knew that he was going to do this. He was gifted. He was a national debate champion. How would you like to have a national debate champion as a father? Wow. You know, you just don't argue with that. Actually, the story is I was born in Oklahoma. I've never been there. I think there's a Three Dog Night song about that or something. But he dropped my mother off to have me. Like a week later, we're back on the road again. And so I was going to church.
So literally, like they're going through Oklahoma and, oh, well, let's have the baby at this hospital?
Well, Mom was from Oklahoma, so he dropped her off at her hometown.
I gotcha.
He probably was around for some of that, you know, but it was just like a real quick, let's stop, have a baby, hit the road. And so from the time I was, you know, literally a week old, I was in church every night. You know, he preached every night, would preach for a week or two or maybe three at a place. And then we moved on. Of course, I don't remember the early days, but I do remember as I got a little bit older, going to church every night. And so there was kind of instilled in us that it was my mother who would say, you don't have to go to church, you get to go to church. There were no excuses for not going. I mean, I'd heard that, you know, if you're an evangelist, this isn't fair. All right, if you're a pastor and you have and we don't call them evangelists so much anymore, although maybe it's coming back a little bit, but you have a guest speaker and everybody says, man, that was the best message I've ever heard, which is, by the way, if you're listening to this and you're in a church, don't tell your pastor that when there's a guest speaker. He doesn't want to hear that.
No.
And the truth is, Darrin, you're a guest speaker. I'm a guest speaker, not in our role at Seacoast, but when you go somewhere else, you've got a message or a couple of messages or 4 messages or whatever. Maybe it's the message for that year. And it just gets better and better and better.
It's the greatest hits.
It's the greatest hits. And so I had heard my dad's greatest hits over and over and over and over again. But we couldn't even get sick and not go to church because my mother would say, being Assemblies of God, we believed in all of the gifts and hey, you know, you're liable to catch a healing. You know, so we needed to be dead in order not to go to church. And I was raised in that environment. My dad was a pastor then for a good while I was growing up. Yeah, so for the most part, I'd say that was a great foundation. You know, there are parts of it that I didn't get. I was, you know, we would have Jericho marches, we'd call them, and usually on Sunday night, I often wondered if Dad just didn't have anything to say, and so he said, you know, let's get to sing it again, you know, and
just one more verse,
and maybe a runner will go, or you know, and that was always hard for me, and I think it speaks more to a lack in me than it does in because I think that in my home, I always grew up in small churches, and people were very, very sincere. Sometimes experienced God in ways that maybe I was distant from. But anyway, that's kind of what it was like for me.
But you probably had some cognitive dissonance. You like rationally, you're going, how is this helping my life running around it?
Yeah.
I mean, there were some real, like, legitimate doubts there, right? About these things.
It was more like I would never invite my girlfriend to this service.
Yeah.
A little bit later on, I remember a friend of mine who, through a series of circumstances, came to Christ and wanted to come to our church. And I thought, no, I lost a girlfriend one time who came to my church on a Wednesday night when a missionary was there. That's as boring as it gets. And still it was too crazy, So there was a little bit of a disconnect for me. But again, and maybe it's my guilt appreciative from growing up. There were a lot of really, really good things. And I have friends that are lifelong friends. But yeah, I began to wonder early on, how does this practically relate to my life outside of, when we walked out of the doors? How does what we're doing here? And it didn't seem to relate a whole lot to that.
And you were an athlete. You were a wrestler.
Yeah.
And so, like, you're in the athletic world. And so when did it all come together? When did Jesus make sense and you trusted him?
Wow. There's probably a couple of, I think I always followed Jesus. From the time I was a little kid, I just followed him at a real distance at times. There was some of that in high school, but my freshman year, I won a championship in wrestling, and a couple of months later, I got a strep throat or something, and it settled into my kidneys and ultimately destroyed some things. And I battled with that for about 3 years. And when I was a junior in high school, after the wrestling season was over, I'd talked my coaches into doctors actually into let me wrestle. Hadn't done well, and I knew that I was in trouble physically, and I wasn't telling anybody because you can't wrestle if you're well, I'm losing anyway, But so as season's over, and I told my dad right away, I said, "Listen, the reason this has been a bad season, I've got problem. I'm peeing blood basically. My kidneys are not working." And we went to back to the specialist. I didn't even finish my 9th grade year. Spent the last month or so in the hospital. And so this fast forward to junior year. And so we went through and redid the tests, and they said, you're going to have a transplant. And I can remember in my father's car, my mom and dad dad's kind of trying to make it where I can't see him, but he's crying. And mom was openly crying. And I remember Andre Crouch was a big Christian artist at the time. And he had a song, I don't even remember the name of it, but it said something, God hadn't brought us this far to leave us, that kind of thing. And I can remember saying that to my parents, and that God hasn't brought us this far to leave us. And something happened, and I was healed. And
in that moment?
I think so. I think so. I've been being prayed for by every healing evangelist for 3 years, and it was embarrassing. It really was. My daughter is going through a cancer thing, and I try to protect her a little bit right now because I know what it's like to every time you come into a building, oh, there's little Greg, and let's pray for him. And, and especially with my kind of not resonating with some of the emotional part of, how I was brought up. And I think in that moment, I do. Anyway, we went back and over the next week, they ran the tests again, and I'm fine. Wow. And I've been fine ever since. And even some of the symptoms that they said would be lifelong because of what was destroyed in those 3 years aren't even there. So I experienced that and knew that. And but really, after I graduated from high school, I went to college, got kicked out of college. It was the 70s. I was working in Denver, and I was thinking, I'm not sure. I know this stuff is true for dad and mom, and I even knew that I had been touched, but is it true for me? So I searched and researched, and everybody was into Eastern religion at that time that I knew, the Beatles and all this kind of stuff. And so I just went on a search of my own and read, the book of Acts and read the book of John, and came to a reality. There was a book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Who wrote that?
Josh McDowell.
Josh McDowell. For most people, the original book would have been boring as a box of rocks. But for me, I was in research because it was written from a scholarly, lawyerly kind of a deal. And through that book, I really came to my own faith in God. Started a Bible study with my buddies, and none of us had read the Bible. I'm a kid, grew up in church. I didn't read the Bible, And so I said, we're gonna study the book of John, and as long as I keep a page or two ahead, I'm going to be fine. And we started a Bible study there in our crash pad. There were 7 of us living together, including some girlfriends, not mine. We parked our motorcycles in the house. It was just a crash pad. It was terrible. But we had a Bible study once a week, and that's kind of where it took off for me.
And then you became a pastor pretty quick after that?
Not real quick after that. I was going to community college in Denver and did some correspondence stuff with the Assemblies of God. It used to be called Berean College at the time. I got married, started working for Hewlett-Packard Company. My father-in-law was real proud of me. He was a union guy, and I actually had a real job. Started going to a small Assembly of God church in Fort Collins, Colorado. Worked in Loveland, Colorado. We just moved up, got married, and didn't like the church. It was more of what I had gone to as a child, but something drew me there. Some people, actually. I remember Debbie and I went, and there were some people that met us in the parking lot as we were trying to leave quickly, and they said, you got to come back. And so I came back that night, and then we call it forced fellowship at Seacoast, during the greeting time, somebody gave me a bank deposit slip. Somebody's going to give me some money. I could use that. And they had circled their phone number and an invitation to come and over to their house, have a game night or something. And Debbie and I didn't like the church, but we liked the people. And we ended up connecting in with the church, and ultimately went on staff as their first staff member, youth pastor, worship leader, janitor, secretary. I did it all. And that was kind of our initiation into ministry.
Okay. So then, let's fast forward. You got a story about you being fired by your dad.
Well, I was fired from my first 3 jobs
in ministry.
In ministry, yeah, as youth pastor. My dad, I was in college at the time in Springfield, Missouri, at Evangel College, and Dad pastored a church in Joplin, just down the road, 60, 70 miles. I had a little Honda car that got 50 miles to the gallon. And they paid me $5 a week, come and do a youth service on the weekend, And Dad thought I was overpaid a little bit, but anyway. So, in our church, we didn't go to movies. Okay, I grew up. I don't know if anybody can relate to this, but we had a long list of things that we were against. We weren't real clear what we were for, but we knew what we were against, and movies was one of those. You didn't go to movies, and so I took a couple of the girls in the youth group. They were the same age as me. They were seniors, and I'm, in college, and took them to see Towering Inferno. I remember to this day.
Google that, listeners.
You can Google that.
A little bit older.
Amazing movie. There was a guy in the church that was at the movie, apparently, that ratted me out to my dad. This was a Saturday night. Ratted me out to my dad on Sunday morning. He said, "How did Greg like the movie?" Dad said, "What movie?" And so he explained it. So soon as Dad was done shaking hands at the door, he called me into the office, and he said something like this. He said, "Did you go to the movie?" I said, "Yes, I did." "Did you take some girls in the church?" I said, "Yes, I did." He said, "You can go to hell if you want to, but you're not going to corrupt the morals of the young women in this church. You are fired." And so Dad fired me right there at $5 a week. And so that was the first time. Then I got fired at the church in Fort Collins after, I think, a year or two And he told me, he said, I'd go back to work for Hewlett Packard if I was you, because you don't have any future in ministry. And so that kind of fired me up a little bit. But anyway, so that's my resume. Would you hire me?
Probably not.
Yeah. And so that's why I've always had to start churches.
Nobody would hire you.
Nobody would hire me.
So you get a vision for planning a church.
Well, actually,
how'd that all happen?
Actually, my wife gave me a book called All Originality Makes a Dull Church. Dan Bowman, I think his name was, and she got it in a bargain books, 25 cents, still got the sticker on it. Basically, it was the premise was you don't have to reinvent the wheel, that God is doing some things in various places, and just kind of look at that and see what he's doing. And it was a study of like Calvary Chapel. You got to understand, this is back in the 70s, so all this is new. A guy named Robert Schuller, and it wasn't Crystal Cathedral, then it was Garden Grove Community Church.
The drive-in church.
The drive-in church, yeah. Had a chapter on him. Gene Getz Bible Church. I don't remember who all was in it, but it had like 6 or 7 different chapters. And I had never been to another church other than the little Assembly of God churches that I had been in. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. And so they had a bibliography in the back, and I bought every book that these guys, now I didn't have any money, but somehow we got them, and I studied them. And I said, I want to be a part of a different kind of church. I had no idea what that meant, but I want to someday be a part of that. And we ended up, after getting fired in Colorado, we ended up living in my parents' basement in St. Louis. And no, I didn't become a Cardinal fan, but Dad was pastoring there.
So close to the kingdom.
So close to the kingdom. He was actually pastoring real close to where you pastored, Darrin.
Yeah.
Inner City Church. My uncle was a denominational official in Illinois with the Assemblies of God. And he said, hey, Dad told him I wanted to pastor a church. What a great background. Fired 3 times as youth pastor. He wants to pastor now. And I had a burning vision inside, and I didn't know exactly what that meant, but wanted to reach people that didn't normally go to church. I think that's kind of where it was. And so my uncle hooked me up with a place where I could candidate. You come in and preach and they vote on you. It was in Pana, Illinois. I'll never forget that. Central Illinois. Little church. It had a church building, nice little church building. Only had nine people there. And my wife and I and our oldest child made 12. I preached. I taught Sunday school. And then they voted. They said, no, thank you. 9-0. No, thank you. And so my wife was really glad because she didn't want to live there. I was like, really?
A lot of corn.
Yeah, a lot of corn. And so my uncle said, next week we've got another one. It's up in Freeport, up in the northwest corner. They've been without a pastor for 7 months, I think. They're going to vote on you, but they really don't have a voice in this. We control it. You're in, but you go do your best. So I felt much more confident that week, and quite a bit bigger church. They had 13 members. Yeah. So anyway, they voted 11 yes and 2 abstentions. And so it was almost like church planting, only you didn't really have the, your core team, your, launch team, we call it now. So we started 1979, Freeport, Illinois, in a little Assembly of God church.
And then what happened with that church?
It was a slow go. God blessed it. Some incredible things happened in me. I can remember I really got a vision for the future of my life, and that's a whole nother story. But over time, it grew. It grew with young adults. It was a very difficult time. It was during the 80s. There was a recession going on. Unemployment was high. We were all poor. It was cold. But it grew to probably 300 or 400 people. And then I began to really sense that I wanted to plant a church in a larger city. It was a small farming community. And that's how we ended up in Charleston.
So one of the craziest stories I've ever heard of a church planter experiencing trauma and crisis. Take us through what happened when you guys got here.
Oh, wow.
To Charleston.
We moved to Charleston, and actually we came here to go on staff at a local church here, Northwood Assembly, used to be Assembly of God, now it was non-denominational, pastored by the husband of my cousin here. And nepotism runs all through my story. You just need to know that. But anyway, we're on staff, largest church I've been a part of. They had about 1,000 people, and I got real comfortable with that we can do this. We could be a staff member here. But we were only here for, I think, 3 weeks, and my mother had cancer at the time. She and my father came up from Houston to visit us, and we had one of these minivans. We all hopped in a minivan to go see one of the, sites here in Charleston, and we were in a really bad car accident. My kids are laying all over the highway. My oldest son Jason is unconscious, and my daughter Jessica is. I handed her out of this van we were in. It rolled over, and we got hit by a semi truck from behind, and just. It's a miracle we lived. It totaled out, I think, 4 or 5 cars in the accident. And I handed my daughter out of the van thinking she was dead. She wasn't breathing. Her eyes were fixed and all of this kind of thing. But fortunately, there were some nurses that got caught in the accident that did CPR on her and brought her to life. And so we find ourselves in a foreign city, literally. And we're on the 8th floor at MUSC Children's Hospital, and my son's still in a coma. My daughter is stitched up and, making progress. And we looked out over this city at night. I can remember doing that, saying, my God, why have you brought us here? We don't know anybody. We actually, it's kind of like you exaggerate when you're down. We knew a few people, but we said, we don't know anybody. We feel like we're following you, and now our life has come apart. So that was our welcome to this city.
Wow. And then what was the process in planning Seacoast from there?
Yeah. Fred Richard, about 3 months into, he was the pastor at Northwood, 3 months into being here, he took me out to Shoney's after church on a Sunday night, and that's never a good thing. Okay. Never a good thing. And
getting asked to lunch and then Shoney's, both are not
no,
good
that's
things.
not
And then
good.
put them together.
Shoney's wasn't bad.
I think they're out of business, Pastor.
Are they out of business? Well, yeah, it probably wasn't a good thing. He said this
Board of Health issues, as I recall.
As I remember, he said, this is probably not working well. And it totally caught me by surprise, because I'm like, this is good. We've got a regular paycheck, which is something we hadn't had in up in Illinois, and we're leading the young adults, and I think we're doing a good job and all of this. And he said, no, you're a senior leader, which I had questions about at that time. Really, even though I'd been a senior leader for about 8 years, I thought maybe my best avenue is as a second chair, third chair. I have no problem with that, and I thank God for those that are called to the second chair and third chair in church. I mean, it's Seacoast. Those are some of people that have really contributed to the growth of this thing. But I thought I could be one of those. And he said, no, you're a senior. There's a church inside of you, is what he said. Basically, he was prophesying to me. It felt like a rebuke, in a sense. But he was
especially after being fired 3 times.
I'm a little gun shy, just a little bit. In fact, I was talking to a counselor the other day, and he said that my rejection meter is kind of high. And that's how I felt. But he saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. And he's one of the most generous men I've ever met in my life. And he said, we have a vision of planting churches in the Charleston area. I think he had 4 kind of circles that he wanted to do. And he said, we want you to plant one in Mount Pleasant, which I lived in Somerville. Hadn't been to Mount Pleasant, had no idea what it was like, and maybe been through to go to the beach. And he said, we want you to start a church, and anybody that lives in that area, they're free game. And so they're very supportive of doing that. But that's kind of how we settled on planting a church here.
So you've made a comment. We were the slowest growing mega church in the history.
Oh, yeah.
Of the, I don't know if you said world or United States.
I think the Galaxy.
Galaxy, okay.
Galaxy. We did in fact, I was just digging through some old archives just recently, and I came on some of the advertising that we did in the early days. And we did a marketing program called, I think it was the Phones for You. Anyway, we called people, went back when phones were attached to the wall by a cord. We called 16,000 homes. That's how many lived over here. And we did a religious survey right at dinner time. Do you attend church? If so, yes. Great. Awesome. Keep going. End of conversation. If not, why do you think people don't attend? And we did a little survey, figured out that people's problems with church, at least here, was not theological. It was sociological. We don't have a problem with God. We got a problem with, people, church, whatever. And so, we worked it, and we had 340 people our first week. It was a large launch, which was unusual back then. And it's kind of how we kind of aim at it with ARC now. But so I thought, I didn't read any books. Nobody told me that you'd have less people, it's that it would settle down. I fully expected it to, just explode. So I called my buddy, Terry Hilgers, back in Denver, Colorado, who was at our home church. Great job. I said, Terry, you got to get out here. I said, revival is going on. I said, we had 340 people our first week, and we'll probably have 500, next week. I would imagine the service was so good. Preaching was just incredible. And, we'll have 1,000 people. They'll be writing, I need your help. And so he moved out middle of the summer, and our revival was a Gideon revival. It was less people every week than it was the week before. It was that way for 3 years. Okay. Imagine that. Church plant, every year you have less people than the year before. You've been fired 3 times. And I'm beginning to wonder what's up here, and I remember Terry would go visit one of our friends in Colorado. Darrin Northrop was his name, had a great church in Fort Collins. It's just growing. And Terry would come back and he'd say, when does this vision thing kick in? I said, get out of my office before I kick you, in or whatever. And I tried to resign 3 times to the elders at our planting church. And they said, no, you started this. You're going to see it through. So we didn't really see growth until year 5. And so I like to say we're the slowest growing mega church on the planet or galaxy now. We're going to claim galaxy.
And you told this story so many times. You guys tried to build a building. They wouldn't let you. That's kind of how multi-site was.
Right.
You were one of the pioneers of multi-site. And then the ARC, you had a vision with Billy Hornsby.
Yeah.
Just talk about that a little bit.
Billy came in to do a small group leaders gathering for us. He was at Bethany, great church, Larry Stockstill down in Baton Rouge, and they had a cell conference every year, and he ran that. He ran their cell network, and so I didn't know
one of the first doing small groups like cell church.
Yeah.
Like they were like the pioneers.
And they were incredible. And so we wanted to have a leader meeting, and so we said, well, Billy Hornsby, I've heard of him. Let's bring him in. So we brought him in and did a Friday night and Saturday. And normally what he would do is then he'd preach on Sunday morning. And I said, you're not going to preach. I don't know you. We do ministry out of relationship. And I'm not sure how he took that at the time, but he stayed and saw the service and said, then he came back 2 weeks later on his own dime, brought his wife, and we played golf. And I've told this story 1,000 times, but it was like an interview session the whole time we were playing golf. It was weird. I thought he was interviewing me for a job. I've got a good job. I like it. But he was interviewing me for the dream of my life, really. And that's what Billy would do. Billy would always have a conversation with somebody and say, at some point, what's the dream in your heart? In fact, with ARC, that's kind of with young couples who want to pastor churches. It's what's God planted there? What's the dream in your heart? So he asked me that, and in an unguarded moment, I said, the dream in my heart is to plant 2,000 churches. And he said, well, awesome. How you doing? I said, we're 0 for 3. We had planted 3 and all of them had closed. He said, I think you've got a model that is something that other people could learn from. He said, what you don't know how to do is to put together, the systems that it takes to reproduce that. And even in the business world, there are a lot of entrepreneurs that they have a dream, they have a vision, they kind of know the product, whatever that is, but to replicate that takes an entirely different gift. And Billy had a different gift. Billy never pastored a large church. He just loved all kinds of people. And he had a brain for systems. And so we said, let's do this together. And out of that grew the first church plants were Church of the Highlands in Birmingham, and then New Life Church in Little Rock. Rick Bezette, Chris Hodges was Billy's son-in-law. Rick was Chris's friend and had been on staff with Billy. And that kind of grew out of that conversation on a golf course.
And now I want to say, what's the number now? 800?
There's over 800 churches that have been planted. Yeah.
Yeah. And then another, 1,500 that relate to it or something.
Yeah, probably close to that. Yeah.
So in that process, you have been a spiritual father to tons of young pastors. How has that, including me, and how, take us through how that happened? Because you didn't experience a lot of spiritual fathering growing up.
Not a lot. I had, my dad was a great guy, and I still respect him. He lives with me now. And so he minds my rules now.
Yeah. Payback.
Yeah, payback. And it's my honor. I just on another note, it is my honor to honor my father in his final years. It really is. But as far as a spiritual father, my uncle was a mentor to me, and that was great. But I remember when I was a young pastor in Northern Illinois and feeling like we're all out there on our own. And actually, Mark Batterson, his father-in-law, Bob Schmidtgall, planted a great church in Naperville, Illinois, Calvary Assembly, or Calvary Temple, I think it was. I remember him reaching out to me and other young guys and just bringing us in. And he'd do a one-day he'd take care of us. He'd feed us, and he'd tell us we're okay. You're going to be all right. That's as close to fathering probably as I had, and it was from a distance most of the time. But I remember how I felt with that, and to this day, I know recently I opened my schedule a little bit because we've gone through a transition at Seacoast and to the next generation, and I asked the ARC team. I said, I want to give a certain number of weeks to just the newest and the smallest churches, because I was there. I remember that. And I love going in and speaking to them and experiencing it and just sitting down with a couple and saying, what's the dream in your heart? I guess, just anecdotally or intuitively, you look around the landscape today, just in America, and with the divorce rate, broken homes, all of that kind of thing, there's a crisis of fathering not even spiritually, just what does it mean to have a dad, to be a dad? And then as I began to look at the landscape of the church planters in the organization that I'm a part of, I thought that's carried through. I was talking to a young guy not long ago, and I sensed some things in him. And so I said to him, tell me about your relationship with your dad. He didn't have one. Dad walked out on him when he was 4 or 5 years old. I said, well, talk to me about your spiritual fathers. And there had been rejection there. And here's a guy out here on his own trying to plant a church without a father figure cheering him on. And I also have seen some guys who try to be fathers, but they compete with their sons.
Yeah.
And that's weird.
Yeah, it's like I think I heard the term sonning. There's a difference between fathering and sonning someone.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so I haven't heard that.
Like you've been sonned.
You've been sonned, but you haven't really been fathered. And, and fathers competing for resources and competing, even at the whole atmosphere of whatever it means to be a planter or a pastor. And I didn't want to see myself as a father because I was too young. I went to a life coach, Christian guy, great guy, as I'm trying to figure out what am I going to be when I grow up, about five or 6 years ago. And he went through I think, 6 levels of a man's life. And it wasn't original with him. And I don't know where it came from originally. I know that the Wild at Heart guy, Eldridge, has written a book, Fathered by God, that talks about those things. But anyway, he said, in this next season for you, you're going to be a wise sage. And I don't know about the wise part, but that resonated with me. And suddenly, I want to say suddenly, but it was a process. I said, I felt in my heart, I can get excited about this. I've taken a lot of mountains. And I think about Caleb, and in the Old Testament, and of course, Caleb was, 40 years old or something like that. He wanted to take the mountain, and him and Joshua come back and give a good report. Hey, there's giants in the land, but we can whip them. Come on, let's do this thing. And they did, and they chose not to. And 40 years later, they're entering the promised land, and Caleb says, hey, I can still take that mountain. I'm as young now as I was then. No, I think he was delusional.
Yeah.
Because an 80-year-old guy's got some things in his body that are not like they were at 40. But here's what he had. He had a young mind. And he had a young vision. And, as I look at that, at 40, Caleb would have gone on the mountain and whipped the giant himself. At 80, he says, I've got a good-looking daughter. If you can whip that giant, you can have my daughter. In other words, he thinks it through, and I don't want to go through all this sexism of that's a whole nother era in time. I understand that. But he knew that he still was valuable, had a gift. Chip Judd, my friend, told me not long ago, he said, I'm not sure you can build a church for the next generation, but you can build the next generation leaders that will build that church. And so that's been, for me, that's marching orders.
It's awesome. And I mean, I've been reading again, kind of looking into the New Testament, specifically Paul, with that fathering thing in mind, based on our relationship. Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk about that in the next episode, just how you have fathered me through the worst part of my life. And you see, Paul literally would not go. It says in 2 Corinthians, he's got this effective door for ministry that the Lord has opened. Mm-hmm. But he wouldn't go there because Titus wasn't there. And then later on, he meets up with Titus and he says, my spirit was refreshed by Titus. So here's Paul saying, God opened this door, but I'm not going, not because my mentor's not there or my peer, but my son's not there. So I just thought that was so interesting that not only was it a situation of, hey, we're trying to get all this ministry stuff done, but no, and I think what he was saying is, if I just go there without a way to replicate ministry, if I just go there and I'm not developing my sons, it's built on me. Mm-hmm. And I like Titus and I want to be with him. So it's like this twofold thing of like, hey, I need to like equip you, but also I want to be with you. I don't want to do this by myself. It's just better.
That's so good. And you know what? At Paul's stage in ministry, there were probably a lot of open doors. But he's not going to go through an open door unless he can bring somebody with him.
Yeah.
And that part of the joy of this era of my life, there are open doors, is to be able to bring somebody else through a door they could never go through. And that's part of being a father.
Yeah. That's what dads do. So as we've talked about doing something like this for a couple of years now, just how can we encourage pastors? What do you see as the vision of this podcast? How does this father son, sagely wisdom, that your stage in life, like what do you see?
Well, first of all, there are no perfect fathers. there are no perfect people. We all have flaws, and a lot of times that can hold you back from, even wanting to put a foot in the water. So I would just encourage anyone who's listening who maybe has a heart for that. If you remember your first child, if you have a child, you weren't a perfect father, and none of us are. And so we've just got to figure this thing out. And what's incredible is that we have, Darrin, you and I, and others have incredible conversations around all kinds of topics. And what's incredible about the age that we live in is that these conversations can become conversations with not just two people, but with hundreds or even thousands of people. And if a podcast like this can become a conversation that helps stimulate the desire for some to be fathers and some to open up as sons, and that's probably not the only thing we're going to talk about, but all of life is kind of about that. I know, my dad would, when I was a kid, would take me to University of Colorado football games, and it was in the car on the way or running through the park, because we never finished the game. We always want to be the first car out of there, and now I see myself doing the same thing with my grandsons, but it was the conversations that happened along the way. And I think we're going to have conversations about a lot of things in this podcast. But if along the way we can encourage one another and spark some things and see that fathering gap, that aloneness deal that is lonely to your core, we've all felt it. If we can see some of that kind of dissipate, that'll be a good thing.
Yeah.
What do you see? What do you see your role as here?
Yeah, I think really just what you said, having people overhear vulnerable, real conversations about life and ministry, and really just giving people permission to not have it all together and to be conversation partners. Nobody, no matter, and we're seeing this now, and unfortunately, in the Christian world, a lot of people we thought had it together didn't have it together.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what I would love to see is, a place where people can acknowledge and own their weaknesses and vulnerabilities, and yet still say, but God can use me.
Mm-hmm.
And in my weakness, and when we 2 Corinthians 12, when, just preach that sermon that, why would God take away the thing that's going to trigger his power? Well, that was the thorn, that was weakness. And I think we're all a little thorny. We're all walking with a limp. Sometimes we don't know it. We hide it with swagger, and we hide it with gifts. But the truth is, underneath everything, those of us who are pastors, we're scared little boys. A lot of us trying to act like we're not, but we are. And if we can encourage each other to go, hey, yeah, there's some fear there, but here's a community of brothers and sisters that we can learn from, I think that'd be a win.
Definitely.
If you're enjoying our show, please subscribe today and give it a rating and a review in iTunes or wherever you're listening. It helps other people find the show. The Pastors Collective is a production of Seacoast Church and Narrativo. It was produced by Mike Cosper. It was edited by Quinette Connor. It was mixed by TJ Hester. Our music is by Dan Phelps. The Pastors Collective is executive produced by Greg Surratt and Darrin Patrick. You can learn more about our show and find transcripts at www.pastorscollective.com. Thanks for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks.